I used to think that the word family meant home, something sacred, soft, and safe, the kind of place where you can bleed openly and still be loved, where mistakes weren't turned into weapons, and silence wasn't used like a noose. But I learned, far too early, that for some of us, family is a beautiful lie that cuts deeper than any stranger's cruelty ever could. My name is Kaya Monroe, and I was born into a family that looked picture perfect from the outside. The kind of people who wore matching outfits for holiday cards, brought home-baked goods to PTA meetings, and smiled like a well-rehearsed sitcom whenever neighbors were watching. But inside our beige, two-story suburban house was a hierarchy so toxic it should have come with a hazard sign. I was the third child, the last one, the accidental one, if you read between the lines, of how my mother described her surprise blessing at baby showers. My sister Morgan was the eldest, the golden child, the straight A, soft-spoken, Instagram-filtered darling, who could do no wrong even when she was very clearly in the wrong. Morgan could lie through her teeth with a Bible in her hand and still get applauded for her poise under pressure. Then came Asher, the only boy, the prodigal son, even when he brought home D's, and reeked of weed. Asher could total a car and still be just going through a phase. And then there was me, the leftover Monroe, the girl with the sharp tongue, the one who asked too many questions, felt too many things, and never learned how to shrink herself small enough to fit their idea of acceptable. I was the one who got blamed when Morgan forgot to pay her credit card, the one who was accused of creating tension every time I dared to point out when someone lied, and the one who got told I was too emotional when I cried and too cold when I didn't. It was like breathing wrong became a crime in that house. Like every time I opened my mouth, I was setting off landmines no one warned me about. At dinners, I was the scapegoat by default. My mom would pass the potatoes with one hand while handing out passive-aggressive jabs with the other. Maybe if Kaya wasn't always so intense, Asher wouldn't feel so anxious, she'd say, folding her cloth napkin like she was folding away any chance of hearing my side. My dad didn't say much. He was more of a silent executioner. His silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. He had this way of clearing his throat or adjusting his belt that sent a clear message. Speak one more word, and you'll regret it. Morgan, meanwhile, played the angel, always conveniently stepping in to mediate, with her fake sweet voice and pitying eyes that made me want to scream. Kaya, maybe you should just take a breath, she'd say, like I was some unstable bomb they all had to carefully contain. The irony? They created the chaos. I just stopped pretending it didn't exist. It got to the point where even the dog, Daisy, started avoiding me during arguments, as if she, too, believed the propaganda. The thing is, I wasn't rebellious. I didn't sneak out. I didn't drink. I didn't even date much. I read books. I drew. I took care of my grandma when she was dying. The same grandma my mom claimed was never really fond of children, even though she held my hand tighter than anyone ever had. That woman was the only one who saw me, who looked into my eyes and didn't flinch. She used to whisper, "They don't deserve your fire, baby girl." And I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later, because the older I got, the more obvious it became that my existence made them uncomfortable. I was a mirror they couldn't avoid, one that reflected their hypocrisy, their favoritism, their shame. I saw too much, remembered too clearly, spoke too honestly. I was inconvenient, and so they twisted every story, every incident, every awkward moment into a version where I was the villain, If Morgan forgot to turn in her FAFSA, she'd say I distracted her by starting drama the night before. If Asher lost his job at the car lot, he blamed my constant negativity and bad vibes for messing with his focus. And my parents, they nodded along like it made perfect sense. Kaya, you need to stop making everything about you, my dad would say, right after everyone had just finished making everything about me. I began to question my own memories, second-guess my own voice, wondering if maybe I was the problem, if I had some kind of emotional defect no one had diagnosed yet. Gaslighting is a slow poison. It doesn't kill you right away. It just makes you doubt the taste of truth until you're swallowing lies like medicine. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday. Cold. Still, I'd just come home from my part-time job at the bookstore, where I'd stayed late helping a nervous teen pick out her first horror novel. I remember feeling warm, content, until I opened the front door and felt the air shift, heavy and hostile. Everyone was in the living room. Morgan stood in the center, clutching her phone, tears running down her cheeks, like she'd rehearsed the scene in a mirror. Kaya stole $3,000 from my account, she said, voice trembling, just enough to sound sincere. My stomach dropped. I blinked. What? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I hadn't even known she had a savings account. You're serious? I asked, looking around the room for someone, anyone, to join me in disbelief. No one did. My mom gasped like a soap opera actress. Asher stared at the carpet, and my dad stood up, slow and stiff, walked toward me like he was preparing for battle, and said words that burned hotter than any slap ever could. You're toxic. You've always been. Toxic. That word clung to my skin like acid. It was final. It wasn't up for debate. It was the truth they'd all been dying to say out loud. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even deny it. I just stood there, frozen in place, letting the weight of years crash down in one silent avalanche. I walked upstairs in a trance. My room looked the same, fairy lights still glowing, my sketchbooks still open on the desk, the blanket I crocheted folded at the foot of my bed. I packed a single duffel bag. Jeans, hoodie, grandma's photo. I didn't need anything else. I knew I wouldn't be back. Before I left, I wrote a note. Just one line. I'm done being your villain. I taped it to the fridge like a resignation letter. Then I opened the door, stepped out into the night, and walked. No one called after me. No footsteps followed. The porch light didn't flicker on. I walked down that street like garbage left at the curb. But instead of despair, I felt something unfamiliar bubbling beneath the numbness. Clarity. They thought they were throwing me away. But what they really did was set me free. And as I crossed the intersection at the end of the block, the wind cold against my cheeks, I didn't look back. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood. I was never the problem. I was just the one brave enough to see it. The wind bit my cheeks as I crossed the intersection at the end of that block the night I left, and I didn't flinch. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it finally matched the chill that had been inside me for years. The one that comes from being blamed for everything you didn't do, from being forgotten in a room full of people who claimed to love you. That cold night led me to a rotting, paint-peeling, sagging studio tucked behind a boarded-up laundromat in a corner of Minneapolis, so quiet it almost felt like the world itself had forgotten it existed. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I could finally breathe without being accused of inhaling too loudly. That run-down place had paper-thin walls and neighbors who fought through them at 3 a.m. But to me, it was freedom. Not glamorous, not comfortable, but mine. The mattress was inflatable and patchy. The heater had a hiss that never stopped, and the kitchen sink constantly leaked into a rusty bucket I had to dump twice a day. But those nights spent eating off-brand ramen while curled up in secondhand blankets felt more nourishing than any holiday dinner with my so-called family ever had. Here, no one rolled their eyes when I spoke. No one twisted my silence into guilt. No one looked at me like I was a storm in a borrowed room. And yet, in that newfound stillness, something old woke up in me. Not sorrow, not fear, but fury. Not the kind that lashes out or screams into pillows, but the kind that sits quietly in your ribs, sharpening itself like a blade, waiting, whispering, building. So I did. I picked up 3 jobs, not out of desperation, but strategy. In the mornings, I was Kaya, the dog walker, trudging through icy sidewalks in worn-out boots, tugging tangled leashes, learning the names of every mutt who trusted me more than my own blood ever had. In the evenings, I was Kaya the waitress, balancing greasy plates and forced smiles under the flickering lights of a dive bar, where tips depended on flirting and patience wore out like soles on cheap shoes. And in the hours between, I was Kaya the builder, the coder, the creator. I taught myself HTML at midnight, learned design at sunrise, offered cheap logos and templates on freelancer forums while my hands shook from caffeine and sleep deprivation. And with every site I built, every piece of code I typed, I felt myself returning. Not the version of me they rejected, but the version they never got to meet, the one they would never control. Then came the click, literal and metaphorical. One client, a twitchy startup founder with big dreams and no cash, emailed me after weeks of collaboration and said, "I can't pay what you're worth, but I can offer you equity." Most people would have walked away. Most people would have asked for the money. But I wasn't most people. I was the girl who'd been accused of theft by her sister, called toxic by her father, and banished without a second thought. I knew what it meant to gamble everything, because I already had nothing. So I said yes. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even celebrate. I just worked. I redesigned their entire UI, rewrote their brand voice, overhauled their online presence, and watched them grow like wildfire. And then, 8 months later, I opened my email to a message that would change my life. They'd been acquired for $7 million. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile at first. I just stared at the number and let it settle into my bones like armor. The money hit my account in waves. Clean, clear, indisputable. And in that moment, I realized something even bigger. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creation, about legacy, about revenge. Not the petty kind, but the kind that builds empires. So I used part of the payout to buy a real mattress, one that didn't deflate by morning. I stocked my fridge with food that didn't come in a styrofoam cup, but the rest, I built a storm with it. I built Scapegoat Creative, named for every time they blamed me, for every accusation I swallowed without a fight. It wasn't just a business. It was a declaration. I didn't post about it. I didn't email my family. I didn't even update my LinkedIn. I started in silence, with people like me, the discarded, the misunderstood, the ones who'd been told they were too much, too complicated, or too broken to belong. I hired a brilliant coder who dropped out of college because her parents said art wasn't practical. I brought in a trans designer who'd been pushed out of 4 agencies for not being a culture fit. I hired a single mom with no resume, but an unmatched eye for typography. We met in rented spaces with chipped paint and buzzing lights, passed around thermoses of black coffee, and worked like we were building something holy. And we were. Clients came, then more. We took the scraps we were handed and turned them into gold. We built campaigns that made people cry. We told stories brands didn't know how to tell. We weren't just designing. We were taking up space in an industry that never made room for us. And the entire time, I said nothing to my family. They still thought I was drifting, homeless, bitter, probably blaming them for everything, like some cautionary tale. I let them believe that. I watched Morgan's Instagram morph into a polished lie. Her as a lifestyle coach, posing with sponsored tea and morning routine reels, trying to convince the world she was balanced while quietly drowning in credit card debt. I saw her fake engagement to a realtor with bad veneers and worse taste in hashtags. I watched my father's dealership go from Monroe Motors, family-owned since '92, to Everything Must Go banners and desperate Facebook Live sales, where he slashed prices like dignity didn't matter. I found Yelp reviews accusing him of fraud, saw pictures of him looking tired, older, smaller. I saw my mom on care.com offering to babysit toddlers and elderly clients with a mother's touch. I screenshotted everything. I bookmarked their struggles. I wasn't watching to gloat. I was watching to know when, because revenge isn't just about striking. It's about timing. And when I saw Morgan post about her new empowerment workshop and noticed the venue was the same sad event hall my dad once used for car expos, a place I knew inside out, I felt the click again. It was time, not to scream, not to fight, but to show. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need an apology. I just needed them to sit in the audience and realize the daughter they tossed aside had built something they couldn't ignore. And soon, they would. It started with an email. Nothing flashy, just one well-crafted, perfectly formal message written under a fake name from a fake company with a real mission. Destruction, strategic and surgical. And it landed directly in the inbox of Morgan's brand management team, which I'd been watching for months, memorizing their patterns, tracking their cycles, knowing exactly when desperation would make them careless. And so I struck when her engagement was faltering and her phony followers were stagnating, with an inquiry that read, "We're seeking to collaborate with a high-profile wellness influencer for a luxury brand expansion." And they didn't hesitate, didn't vet, didn't even slow down. Before replying, "Morgan Monroe is our strongest voice," practically salivating over the idea that their polished fraud could finally cash in on something that looked like real credibility. And I smiled as I drafted the follow-up, scheduling a Zoom call under the name Vanessa Delane, using a deep-fake filter, modulated voice software, and a beachfront background that screamed success. And when Morgan logged in with her glass of cucumber water and that smug little nod she thought made her look humble, I almost laughed. But I didn't, because this wasn't the time to gloat. It was the time to bait the hook deeper. So I told her she was radiant, that she was exactly what we envisioned for our campaign. And she ate it up, nodding and rambling about spiritual resonance and divine alignment, none of which she understood, but all of which she thought sounded expensive. And I presented her a contract that looked like every other influencer deal she'd ever signed, except buried in the 10th page, behind clauses she wouldn't read, was full admin access to her analytics, her email marketing platform, and the back end of her entire operation, masked under the term temporary audit controls. And when she signed it within the hour, I knew I was in, not just in her business, but in her bloodstream, her digital pulse, the skeleton of the lie she'd built around herself. And I didn't hesitate. Within the first 24 hours, I confirmed what I already suspected. Her followers were mostly bots, her reviews fabricated, her testimonials recycled from other coaches who never knew she existed. And I got to work, documenting everything, crafting anonymous reports to send to platforms, whistleblower tips to Reddit moderators, and then I triggered it. I tipped a micro-influencer watchdog account with receipts, screenshots, and data that lit up Twitter like fireworks. And soon came the Reddit post titled Morgan Monroe, Real Coach or Real Scam, which exploded overnight with dozens of stories. Some I hadn't even planted, from real people who'd been ghosted, scammed, or emotionally manipulated by her nonsense coaching programs that promised empowerment but delivered canned PDFs and automated emails. And while she went live sobbing on Instagram about jealous trolls, the rest of the internet tore her persona apart, piece by plastic piece. And I didn't blink, didn't flinch. I simply moved on, because this wasn't about one hit. It was about unraveling them all, starting with the next target. My father, Kenneth Monroe, who once told me I'd never amount to anything without the family's help. And so I built a fake venture firm called Harlan and Reese Capital, gave it a stunning website, registered a burner phone number with a business voicemail and a generic LinkedIn profile, and emailed his dealership under the guise of a private equity firm seeking Midwest family-owned acquisitions. And he swallowed it like gospel, replying within hours, offering to jump on a call to discuss potential synergies. And I let the AI voice I'd programmed do the talking while I sat in the background, watching his face on the screen. Older now, thinner, angrier, bragging about his legacy and lying about profits. And I asked for internal financials to evaluate scale, which he provided, cocky and careless, including falsified tax documents, off-the-books cash deals, and contracts he shouldn't have been able to produce without legal oversight. And I archived it all, packaged it into a whistleblower file, and sent it directly to the Department of Revenue, unsigned, untraceable, and accurate enough to spark a full audit, which it did, because 3 weeks later, the website for Monroe Motors redirected to a 404 error, and Yelp reviews began flooding in from people claiming canceled appointments, suspicious charges, refund battles, and one even attached a photo of state agents standing outside the lot, clipboard in hand, while my father, the king of denial, vanished from Facebook, removed CEO from his LinkedIn, and went uncharacteristically silent. And still, I didn't stop, because there was one more who needed to feel it. Evelyn Monroe, my mother, the woman who told me to get over it when I cried in middle school, because Morgan ripped up my diary and read it out loud at dinner. The woman who said, "You exaggerate everything," when I tried to explain how small they made me feel. The woman who, now that she had no kids, left at home, and no husband who respected her, tried to rebuild herself by babysitting other people's children through a service she named Evelyn's Tender Care, which made me laugh out loud for the first time in days. And so I hired a gig worker, a sweet, believable woman with a story Evelyn wouldn't resist, a single mom with twins, no support, desperate for help. And every time Evelyn agreed to the job, every time she prepared the snacks and texted cheerful confirmations, no one ever showed, because I made sure of it over and over again, using different numbers, identities, and excuses. I made her cancel lunches, miss appointments, and sit on the front step alone, looking confused, because I wanted her to feel the exact brand of emotional whiplash I lived through for 25 years. And when her reviews dropped from 5 stars to 2, when clients stopped responding, when she removed her ads and replaced her flyer on the grocery store bulletin board with a handwritten apology begging for reliable clients only, I knew I'd finally cracked something in her too. And the beauty of it all was that none of them, not Morgan, not my father, not Evelyn, had any idea that the chaos wrapping around them like wildfire had my fingerprints all over it. And I didn't need them to, because this revenge wasn't about shouting, wasn't about exposing myself. It was about watching them squirm in a storm they thought came from the sky, when really it had been blooming in my chest for years. That envelope might have been elegant, but the storm it carried was nothing short of divine destruction. Embossed in gold, pressed with a wax seal bearing my initials, and delivered by a chauffeur wearing gloves so white they looked sterile, it landed on their doorstep like a royal summons from the daughter they once called an unmarketable burden. And I imagined their hands trembling as they opened it, reading the words they never expected to associate with me. You're cordially invited to the grand launch of Scapegoat Creative, a women-led agency founded by someone you once considered worthless. And beneath that, a brutal RSVP line. Dress code, humility, followed by the location, the Thornton Ballroom, the same venue where my sister's engagement party once took place while I served wine in silence by the wall. And now I had booked the entire place out with a single transfer from my business account, even paying triple to ensure the same florists, same photographer, same catering team, and I even requested the pianist play the exact same set list, because I wanted them to feel the sting of the mirror I'd created, one where I was no longer background noise, but the central force, and the reactions came in fast. Mom's group chat lit up with, "Is this a prank? Is she serious? Scapegoat Creative? Is that some kind of joke at our expense?" And I laughed as I watched the chaos from the analytics dashboard of the RSVP page, where their names popped up one by one, hesitantly marked attending, because curiosity is a disease to the narcissistic, and I knew they couldn't help but come. Not just to see what I'd done, but to validate whether they'd been wrong about me all along. And they had. Oh God, they had. But they wouldn't just learn that. I would make them feel it, deep in their chests, like panic before a crash. And for the next few weeks, I worked like a woman possessed, rehearsing my speech every night with my reflection until I didn't see the girl they used to mock anymore. Just a war machine in lipstick, because that night wasn't about debuting a business. It was about burying an era, the one where they could pretend I was disposable. And when the night finally came, I arrived, not in some borrowed dress or clearance heels, but in a midnight blue custom gown, stitched by the very designer who once refused to loan to me for my sister's birthday, stepping out of a car that purred like vengeance into the same red-carpeted entrance where no one had ever announced my name before. But this time, the doorman said it loud and slow. Ms. Lennox Grace, founder and CEO of Scapegoat Creative. And heads turned like dominoes. All those former classmates, distant relatives, family friends, who once gossiped about how I was odd or still figuring herself out, now gasping as I walked by with my assistant beside me, who whispered updates like, "Your mother's at table 3, already downed her first glass," and "Your sister looks like she saw a ghost." And every detail had been crafted for psychological precision. The centerpiece, was a twisted tree, growing from glass shards, representing how I built myself from their wreckage. And the gift bags included branded mirrors inscribed with, "Look what you missed," because this was no launch. It was an autopsy of their arrogance, and when I finally stepped onto the stage, the room fell to a hush so sharp it felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, the spotlight finding me like a truth bomb, ready to detonate. And I didn't smile. Not yet. I just took a breath and began. Good evening. Some of you know me as Lennox. Some of you only remember me as the artsy one who never quite fit in. Tonight, I'd like to reintroduce myself as the woman who turned being overlooked into a strategy. And the gasps were subtle, but delicious, like cracking creme brulee. And I continued, walking slowly across the stage as behind me, a massive screen displayed a reel of photos they'd forgotten existed. Me at age 10, painting in the garage because I wasn't allowed to mess up the living room. Me in college, eating cup noodles while my sister posed in Greece. And finally, my favorite one. Me holding the rejection letter from our family's trust fund board while my dad's signature glared in ink. And I paused, looked out over the audience, and said, "You didn't just ignore me. You tried to erase me." And I watched my father shift in his chair like he'd swallowed something sharp. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because then I told the room how Scapegoat Creative was born in the attic of a rented house while I worked 3 jobs. Built it with women like me, dismissed, underestimated, stepped over, and how we now represented Fortune 500 clients, including Lexitech, the same company that had fired my brother just 3 months ago. And I said it calmly, like a weather report. Yes, we're managing Lexitech's full rebranding. Ironically, it was their CEO who told me, "You have the kind of resilience we pay millions for." And a few people clapped nervously, but I wasn't fishing for applause. I was dismantling them brick by brick. And when I closed the speech with, "Thank you for teaching me exactly who not to be," the lights dimmed and a final quote flashed behind me. "When they label you the scapegoat, make them the witness." And that was when I saw it. The look I'd waited my whole life for. My mom's wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, my sister blinking rapidly like she might cry, and my father whispering something to himself, probably rehearsing an apology I'd never accept. But the best part was still to come, because as the music kicked in and the party resumed, I made my rounds, stopping at each table just long enough to make eye contact and nod politely, like a stranger might to a former teacher. And when I reached my family's table, I didn't sit. I simply placed a white envelope next to my mother's plate and said, "This one's for you," then turned and walked away as her hand trembled to open it, revealing a check, not for charity, not for guilt, but a reimbursement. Every cent they had ever spent on me, from diapers to dental work, itemized and signed by my accountant, because I didn't owe them a damn thing anymore. And I wanted them to feel that down to their bones, to know that they had no financial claim, no moral leverage, no emotional tether left. And as the camera crew we'd hired to document the launch began discreetly filming interviews, a reporter leaned toward my father and asked, "How does it feel to see your daughter like this?" And he answered with something half mumbled. But by then, the mic had already caught it. "We never thought she'd make it." And I smiled as I overheard it, because that was the perfect quote for the press kit I planned to send out the next day. And when the night ended, guests left buzzing with disbelief and awe. Hashtags already trending. Scapegoat, no more. Built from silence, she snapped back, and I stood on the balcony of the ballroom, watching the city lights shimmer beneath me. Phone vibrating nonstop with messages from people who once ignored my emails, now begging for collaborations, invitations, even forgiveness. But all I did was block the numbers, toss the checkbook into my assistant's bag, and say, "This is just the beginning," because I hadn't launched a company that night. I had launched a revolution, and they didn't even see it coming. The ballroom lights had long dimmed. The champagne flutes collected. The last heel clicked out onto marble. But the aftershocks of that night were only beginning to ripple. Not through just one family or one circle of influence, but through an entire system that had quietly taught generations of girls to shrink themselves to fit inside the invisible walls of legacy. And now those walls were cracked, crumbling, collapsing with every headline, post, and whisper that circulated like wildfire across timelines and TV panels alike, each one anchored by a name that once carried the weight of rejection and now carried power. Lennox Grace, no longer a question mark in the margins of someone else's narrative, but the headline, the origin point, the climax and conclusion, all at once. And the irony wasn't lost on me when reporters called the very next morning, not asking for a statement, but for rights. Rights to tell my story, rights to option the film, rights to run exposés with photos I had once taken in hiding, now framed as proof of early genius. And I approved nothing until I spoke to my legal team, because I'd earned the right to filter how the world consumed me. No longer an object of sympathy or speculation, but a symbol of resilience. And when The Atlantic published a piece titled "The Discarded Daughter Who Built an Empire," my phone nearly combusted under the weight of new inquiries. Coaches, investors, panel organizers, women's networks, even Ivy League deans begging for keynotes. And I said yes to one that made my throat tighten when I read the invite. TEDx Women, Breaking the Bloodline. How we become what they tried to bury. And I accepted not for the press, not for the photos or applause, but for every girl who sat in a dim room wondering if she was broken, because her family said so. And when I stood under the red circle weeks later, dressed in a steel gray pantsuit, stitched with the same fire I carried in my veins, I looked out into that room full of strangers and knew they weren't strangers at all. They were survivors of the same silence, the same belittling, the same invisible knife that carves not enough into the backs of daughters. And I spoke with no notes, no teleprompter, only memory and marrow, guiding my voice as I said, "You were never the problem. You were the spark, and no legacy built on exclusion deserves your loyalty." And the audience rose before I even finished, some with tears, some with clenched fists, all with that same look I had once begged for in a mirror. Recognition, not as someone broken, but someone becoming. And when I walked backstage, the TED team swarmed me with congratulations. But all I felt was calm, the kind that only arrives when your truth finally outruns your trauma. And in the background, my phone pinged with an update. Morgan's coaching page had vanished, replaced by an Instagram grid of discount skincare offers and teary-eyed live streams about reinventing herself. But even in those desperate little pitches, her tone held no humility, only bitterness masked as gratitude, like she still hadn't learned the lesson that the universe now screamed into her inbox daily. And I didn't engage, didn't watch more than a second, because her downfall was a consequence, not my obsession. And then came the headline about Dad. His dealership seized by the IRS for back taxes he'd hidden behind shell companies and falsified expense sheets. And I read the article like a stranger might, detached, analytical, my only thought being, of course, because the empire he'd tried to keep me out of had been rotten long before he pushed me away. And Mom, she waited until every bridge had crumbled to send her olive branch. And even then, it wasn't a call or a voice memo or a knock on the door. It was an email, cold and careful, with the subject line, "I didn't know," and the body of it read like confession, dressed up as vulnerability. "We didn't realize what we did to you until the world showed us who you became. Can we talk?" And I stared at it for a long time, not with anger, but with a kind of surreal sadness, because her words weren't an apology. They were a reaction to consequence, a plea made only when silence became inconvenient. And I didn't reply, not because I hated her, but because healing had taken me too far beyond her reach, into a life that no longer orbited her disappointment or her favoritism or her scripted expectations. And in that quiet decision not to respond, I felt a liberation more powerful than any confrontation, because some doors aren't slammed. They're simply never opened again. And from that space of detachment, I built not just a life, but a legacy, one rooted, not in proving them wrong, but in proving myself right. And I bought a home high above a lake in Oregon, where the fog kisses the windows each morning, like the earth itself is reminding me I'm held, not haunted. And I filled it, not with echoes of the past, but with warmth, color, and laughter, the kind that comes from women who once thought their dreams were optional, until I told them they weren't. Because I didn't just retreat, I reached back, founding mentorship programs for girls who aged out of foster care and had no idea how brilliant they were, launching scholarship funds under the name Grace Grit Grant, because I wanted them to wear their pain like armor, not shame. And I watched them rise, like I once did. Some starting companies, some joining Congresswoman Avila's team, one even opening an art gallery in Harlem that centered women of color. And every time I visited one of their milestones, I brought a journal with me, not to write down their stories, but to hand it to them, blank pages and all, because their voice didn't need to be saved by mine. It needed to be honored by theirs. And I slept every night, not just in peace, but in purpose, the kind that never once flickered from needing my parents' approval, because I had outgrown the child who craved it, and the legacy they once tried to gatekeep became irrelevant, because I was the legacy now, the walking embodiment of what happens when you bloom in the cracks they left behind. And when people stop me on the street, or in airports, or cafes in foreign cities I once only dreamed of visiting, they didn't say, "Weren't you the one they threw away?" They said, "You're the reason I didn't quit." And that's when I knew the revenge was complete, not because they had failed, but because they no longer mattered. And I didn't just survive them, I transcended them. And when a girl once whispered to me at a conference, "How did you survive people who made you feel like nothing?" I smiled, not with bitterness, but clarity, and replied, "I didn't survive them. I outgrew them." And she nodded like I had handed her a sword. And maybe I had, because that's what we do now. Those of us who rose from familial ashes, we hand each other the blades that were once turned on us, and we cut paths through the world no one thought we deserved, and we build dynasties not on inheritance, but intention. And one night, months later, as I sat alone by the lake, watching the stars ripple across black water like secrets, I whispered to the wind, "You didn't just lose a daughter, you lost a dynasty." And the echo that came back wasn't from the trees or the water or the sky, but from the girl I used to be, finally quiet, finally free, finally whole. And in that silence, I became something even I hadn't imagined. Not a rebellion, not a return, Not even a revenge story, but a revolution cloaked in grace. And as the wind brushed past me one more time, I closed my eyes and said the words that now tattooed every breath I took. I'm not their scapegoat anymore. I'm their shadow, towering above what they'll never become.